today? Doing good? Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, yesterday was just fantastic. We got a little break from the heat when we got out. I had a little road rash here. My brother-in-law came with his two nephews, and we were out there playing a little football, and I laid out, and there was a beautiful defensive play. So I'll tell you about it later on. I'll put a little extra details in there for you if you want. But we won. My team won.
Of course.
You know that. We started last week a series on 1 Corinthians, and so we're going to continue that. We introduced the letter, and as we go through this, we're going to have sometimes, some weeks we'll deal with a little section, other weeks a bigger section. This morning, only somewhat of a little section, verses 10 through 18. So if you want to turn to chapter 1, verses 10 through 18, that's where we'll be here in just a minute. As I think about this, you know, the world in which we live today, I think would have caused Paul a great deal of sadness. And I'm not talking about, the violence and hatred that we experience, kind of the wars and the killings, senseless killings that we have, nor the immorality and worldliness, because all of those were there in Paul's day. He had all of that. What I mean is the division of Christianity into this kind of myriad of independent, often competing entities. Let's face it, most of the time when Christians divide, it's not a pretty sight. It's not an amicable separation. In fact, they often occur in the context of a great deal of anger and sometimes even bloodshed. And so as we think about, for example, the Protestant Reformation, that was a time of very intense division and fighting. And so not only did the Protestants and the Catholics go to war with each other, but even those who were all kind of united in their protest against the Catholics didn't unite together as one people, and they were often fighting each other. Instead, the protests took multiple forms, and it resulted in each of these groups becoming a new competing church. And so today we think nothing of entering a city, especially in the South, and finding a church on every corner. In fact, finding a church across the street from each other. In fact, finding a church right next door to another church, and those churches have nothing to do with each other. Indeed, they often find themselves in competition with each other, trying to sell a better brand of Christianity. And although these days it's somewhat of a more civil environment than it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago with the rise of the ecumenical movement, it's the case that oftentimes that competition hasn't ceased, and where some see diversity, there's really still division. And so we want to talk about this today, because this is not the vision that Paul had of the church, and it's certainly not the vision that Jesus had when he prayed that all his followers would be one. But it's just such a situation that Paul is facing in the church at Corinth, as we saw last week. As we learned last week, Paul hears from Chloe's people that something's going on, something that's not right, factions are forming. And so let's pick up where we left off, and we'll read once again the text we heard earlier, beginning in verse 10. I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is that one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. No, I did baptize also the household of Stephanus. Beyond that, I don't know whether I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. So last week we learned and we talked about the fact that Paul was the founder of this congregation, and he had been the first missionary to come to Corinth and convert people to the Christian faith. And after he left, this man Apollos comes from Ephesus and comes as the second preacher / evangelist of the Corinthian church. You'll notice in this text that it also mentioned factions surrounding both Peter and Christ, which are really interesting because as far as we know, Peter has not yet been to this church at all. So you're wondering, okay, who are those folks? Could be that it's simply Jewish Christians that are claiming kind of their Jewish heritage. And then what's the deal with the Christ group? I have no idea about that one, because you'd think if they're just claiming Christ, Paul would say, that's the group everybody should be a part of, but he doesn't. But what's interesting is, as we move on in this letter, we're going to find that those two names fade away, and it really becomes Paul and Apollos that seem to be the point of contention here in this church. And so that's resulting in divisions. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever had the wondrous privilege of being part of a church split. It's never a pretty sight, as I've said. And churches split for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes they divide because of theology. You know, there's a point of doctrine. It's their view of church or Christ or the Holy Spirit or whatever it might be. And this is the type of split that we might say happened during the Reformation. When Luther goes away from the Catholic Church, it was over doctrine, it was over theology. But there's all kinds of other reasons why people split from one another. Worship styles are a big thing this day, at least among certain groups. My own tradition, I'm from the Churches of Christ. When we at 4th Avenue in Franklin decided that we would go instrumental, and for those of you not familiar with the Churches of Christ, is traditionally a non-instrumental group. So when I was the preacher there, and we said, well, we're going to go and we're going to add instruments, we had a whole host of people leave because they didn't agree with that. In fact, I've been privileged to be part of a number of church splits. They weren't caused by me, but I've just experienced that. And so I know there's all kinds of wonderful issues. In fact, I remember sitting in a church meeting one time where people almost came to blows over the songbook that we were going to use. That was back in the days when we actually used songbooks. You know, we didn't have the screen. And so they were fighting over that. And so there's this myriad of options of why churches split. And one of those very common reasons is because of preachers. You know, some are loyal to the preacher, others dislike the preacher. And so once again, when I was a kid, our preacher left to go back to Texas. Well, we had an associate minister at the time, and so some thought, well, it's just logical. We'll take the associate minister and let him become the preacher. And others said, but he can't speak. And so the church ended up splitting. Some went with the associate minister, and he became their preacher, and we got another guy. So it caused a split. So I'm well versed in how this stuff works. And in Corinth, it appears that the quarreling has nothing to do with doctrine. It has everything to do with this kind of loyalty to certain teachers and preachers. And it appears at least that some are promoting their preacher as the best, as the guy, whether that be Paul or Apollos. And as we'll see a little bit later on, it appears that Apollos was probably a better speaker than Paul was. More polished, if you will. And this phenomenon would have been perfectly understandable in the ancient world because they were used to this kind of thing. It happened, especially among philosophers, all the time. And you might be thinking, philosophy? Hardly anyone thinks about philosophy today. I mean, that's that department at the university that, you know, like 3 people are part of, and they have trouble getting students for their classes. No one wants to take philosophy. But philosophy in the ancient world was actually quite a bit different. They did teach you about thinking. They taught you how to view the world and how the world works and all that stuff. But they also taught you a way of life. They had ethics. There was, here's how you can prosper in this world. Here's the best way to have a fulfilling life. And they also formed communities, kind of like churches. And so they had disciples. And each philosopher and philosophical school had a gathering around them. And that led to this kind of partisan spirit, because if you were a disciple of a particular philosopher, of course you thought your system was the best. It was better than somebody else's system, and you would kind of promote that. And so students would often be fiercely loyal to their teachers and disdain other particular groups. So as we go through this letter, we're going to find that these the Corinthians, who are coming from a Gentile background, most of them are Gentiles, that they're taking their culture that they were raised with, this kind of pagan culture, and the values of that culture, and they're bringing it right into the church. And so they're thinking and acting like they would have done before they were Christians. Because remember, they're only a few years old as Christians. They've only been in this thing for a few years. So it takes a while for them to be reshaped and reformed. So it appears as if they are thinking about Paul and Apollos kind of like philosophers. And their loyalty is to the one who discipled them. And so a good bit of the problem goes back to conversion. And so some at Corinth, of course, would have been converted by Paul, but then after he left, when Apollos came, there have been others that would have been converted by him. And now each of those groups is expressing their loyalty in an inappropriate way. And that helps us, I think, understand why Paul brings up this topic of baptism. Go back to verse 13. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you, except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. It seems that those who were baptized by a particular teacher, they view that guy as their leader, and they're loyal to him. Now, it's interesting because the two names that are mentioned by Paul here, we actually know from other places. So if you go back to Acts 18 that we read last week, you'll notice that Crispus was the synagogue leader of the Jewish synagogue in Corinth, and he was one of the early converts of Paul there in Corinth. And Gaius, we actually read about him in Romans 16. And if you remember that Romans is actually written from Corinth, Paul is referencing a guy in Corinth who appears to have been a host, not only of Paul, but he also says of the whole church. So that evidently Gaius was a more wealthy Christian who was hosting the church in his home. Now, there's also that curious verse. I'll point it out in passing, verse 16, where he's going on and he says, oh yeah, I also did baptize the household of Stephanus. As if Paul had forgotten and then somehow suddenly remembered. What's interesting about that is we find out at the very end of this letter that Stephanus had come from Corinth to Ephesus where Paul is. And so I always have it in my mind that Stephanus is kind of in the room as Paul's dictating this letter. And he gets to that point and says, hey, Paul, remember me as well? And so he's, oh yeah, that's right. Stephanus as well. Remember, they're not writing this on a computer, so he just keeps going. So when he says he's thankful to not have baptized more people, and that hurts me as a church Christer, right? Because baptisms are a thing. But he's saying personally, he has nothing against baptism. It's just, I'm glad that I didn't physically baptize more people, because that would mislead more people into thinking that I'm their leader, that I'm the guy. And so for such a thought, that Paul was in any way responsible for their salvation, that's just horrific for Paul, because he's always trying to point people to Christ. To Jesus. It's about Jesus. Christ, not Paul, is the one who was crucified for them. So there are several things in this text that are kind of hinted at that we're going to touch on next week, so I'm kind of saving them for next week. One of those is this idea that somehow preaching with wisdom and eloquence will empty the cross of Christ of its power. We're going to talk about that next week. But this morning I want to focus on this kind of curious phrase in verse 18. I don't remember even what it said in this version I had up there, but in this other text I have, it talks about the message of the cross. The idea of the message of the cross. What in the world is the message of the cross? I've asked students over the years what they think that means, and they always have a hard time coming up with what that actually is. Of course, it's another way of talking about the gospel. It's another phrase for what we would encapsulate under gospel. But it's curious that he uses that language. It's the message of the cross, specifically. That's the key element here. And so I want us to think a little bit about this idea and what Paul might encapsulate under that. And there's three different things, three different aspects or elements of the message of the cross I want us to think about. They're not necessarily found exactly here in this text, but they're found in the writings of Paul as he talks about salvation. But before we do that, I want us to remember the scandal of the cross, right? That for us to kind of bandy about the word cross, it's like, oh yeah, no big deal. But in Paul's day, this is the instrument of capital punishment of the Roman state. There's nothing noble about being crucified, nothing honorable about being crucified. If you're crucified, that means that you're either a Roman criminal or you're an enemy of the state. And so this would be kind of like a cult forming around somebody who had been killed in the electric chair. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that you want to highlight. Come, join us, the followers of the guy who was killed in the electric chair. It's like, really? That's just strange. But rather than hiding that element, Paul embraces this because it's the very heart of his message. So what is at the part of this message of the cross? I think at the center of this stands, on one hand, the aspect of what the cross accomplishes. And when we talk about that, we often throw it out very religious kinds of terms, like redemption, or atonement, or reconciliation. All those kinds of words that we then have to explain. What does that mean? So the word I like the best, because I think it resonates with most anybody, is forgiveness. Because we all kind of can connect with that. We know what that word means, and we, in some sense, long for forgiveness. The sin that stood between us and God, this barrier that it created, has been taken care of through the cross. We have been made clean because Christ was willing to take our punishment. Very familiar kind of message in the Christian faith, a cornerstone of our faith in some ways. But it's been spoken of so many times that we often don't hear it, can't hear it anymore. It's like a hackneyed phrase. So overused as, oh yeah, I know that. But we get a glimpse of it when you see a new Christian for the first time embracing that message, and you see the joy in their faces, and you're like, wait a minute, I remember that feeling when I first realized the significance of that message. Because oftentimes it becomes old hat to us. Another aspect of this message of the cross that is a bit more subtle, I think, in Paul's writings, but it's there nevertheless, is that in the cross, we find out, we learn what true love means. We see the love of God in His willingness to give up His Son. We see the love of Christ in His willingness to sacrifice Himself. And it's a love that has nothing to do with attraction or infatuation. It is a selfless act done purely for the sake of the other. That Jesus dies, gaining nothing for Himself except the people who have rejected Him. And so we're going to explore next week this idea a little bit more, that this is a foolish message because it was done by the God, the creator of all things, who had all power. And He did it in such a way that it cost Him everything. And there's a foolishness to that. We'll talk about that next week. But the cross shows us true love. It shows us God acting on our behalf when we were still helpless, calling us back. He takes the first step, even though we're the ones that walked away. He takes the first step to reconcile us to Him. He shows us, I still love you. I'm calling you home. I'm calling you back. But there's another aspect, a third aspect to the message of the cross, and it's a far less popular one. It's far more difficult for us to hear. It's the call to imitation. As Jesus said in the Gospels, if anyone wants to be my disciple, let him take up his cross and follow me. It's a message that I think is muted in the contemporary church, but it's an integral part of this larger narrative. If you go back and you remember the problem starts with humans and their rebellion. Humans decide, we're going to pursue our own interests. We're going to pursue our own desires. We're going to do what we want to do. And that creates this barrier. This leads to two fundamental problems. One, of course, is our separation from God. But the other, which we've talked about before, is our separation from each other. And that's why it's not accidental that the very first story outside of the garden is when Cain kills his brother, Abel. Because when God is not in your life, you're at odds with each other. And so God, through the cross, of course, is dealing with the problem of our separation from Him. He's calling us back. But He also has to remove this barrier that exists between us. He has to deal with the problem of separation of humanity, because this too is a sign of a broken world. So God takes care of the problem of sin. He calls us back into relationship with himself by demonstrating his love on the cross, by taking the first step. But in the same act, he's showing us through the cross a new way to live. A way that's very, very different from the way of the world. The way of the cross. Living life in such a way that we consider what is best for the other. That we're willing to pay the price to make that happen. That we pour ourselves out for the other. That we sacrifice ourselves for the needs of others. That we give up our own desires and serve the larger good. And the place where this is meant to be seen most clearly by everyone is in the church. That's why it was created. Where people of all different backgrounds can come together. See, the church was a place where people are supposed to truly love each other and care for each other. The church is meant to be a refuge from the world. The church is a place where that selfish backbiting does not exist. Where the harmful gossip is left far behind. Where insisting on getting your own way just does not happen. That's what the church is meant to be. It's meant to be this place where people from all of these different walks of life and cultures and backgrounds and ways of thinking, personalities, can coexist. And so in the early church, you had slaves and masters worshiping together in a new way, in a different kind of relationship. You had Jew and Gentile now coexisting side by side, now as something completely different, as Christian, united under the cross. So when the church exhibits division and divisiveness, it's completely undermining its witness. When the world sees factions, it sees what it always sees. And the power of Christ is muted. So that's why in verse 10, Paul goes back and says this: I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, that there be no divisions among you, and that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. Now, first a word about that, just that phrase. That word united is kind of interesting. I like that word. But the word in Greek actually has a whole lot richer value to it than simply united. You see, this word means something more like mended or restored, put back, repaired, put back into the condition it was to begin with. This is the very same word, and I love this image. When Jesus is walking by the Sea of Galilee, you remember he sees James and John, and what are they doing? They're mending their nets. They had these nets which used to be whole, and when they used them, they got torn and ripped apart, and they have all of these little rips in them, and so they're sewing it back together. That's the same word. I want you to be mended back to the condition you were before. Whole, united, one people. That's what Paul is pleading for. That the Corinthians who had been made one in Christ, but are now finding themselves fractured, become that one people again. And it's a message that we need to take seriously. But how do we achieve that? Now, I've got to move this over here. I want to come out here just a little bit. I've got a lot of experience on this, because my particular movement started this way. The whole beginning of the Restoration movement was all about unity. It was all about seeing divided Christianity and saying, you know what? This is horrendous. God doesn't want this. We all need to be one. The problem was, we came up with the wrong way entirely of doing that. And it came down to everybody has to be exactly the same. That we all have to think exactly the same. We all have to do exactly the same. That church has to look identical no matter where you are. And I found out from a lot of experience, that doesn't work. So one of the things that we need to recognize is that we're diverse and we'll always be diverse. So we have to figure out, what is it that unites us? It's not every point of Christian practice. That there has to be a central element that binds us together, that holds us together, united under the cross of Christ. Because otherwise we'll be fractured. So being a part of this movement, I had this interesting experience. I stole this idea, by the way, from another preacher at 4th Avenue. This is Church of Christ. Again, we grew up with this idea that if you're not part of the Church of Christ, you're not a Christian. I said, well, how do you overcome that mindset? So I decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to start praying every week for a church in our town. This is Franklin. And I didn't mean, like some of them would have taken me, pray for their salvation, because, evangelism to us was converting the Baptists to Church of Christ, make them real Christians. I meant we called them up. And we said to the local Presbyterian church, what can we pray for you today? Now that shocked them, first of all. But it reminded us, hey, we're part of a larger community in this city. And I had this interesting experience, this fascinating experience. I got this letter one time from, we just prayed for the local Methodist church, which, by the way, has a brand new, huge complex down in Franklin. One of the ministers that was my neighbor before I moved. But I had this interesting experience. I got this letter after praying for that particular community of this guy who had grown up in Franklin back in the 60s. And he said, I grew up in this divided religious household that my mother was a Church of Christ lady and my dad was a Methodist. So one week I'd be at the Church of Christ and the other week I'd be with the Methodists. And every time I was at the Church of Christ, I'd hear my dad and his people condemned. And he says, this morning, I heard something completely different. And it just transformed me because he recognized the power of the gospel to change people's hearts. And to recognize that we can be one, we can stand as one under the cross of Christ. And what I love about this church, as small as we are, is, man, we come from so many different backgrounds. Not just cultural backgrounds, but theological backgrounds. But we're one. We're a community, and that's the power of the gospel. And so one of the messages as we leave here this morning to think about is, we want to grow, we want to spread the gospel, but we don't want to do that by stealing other sheep. It's not like we're going to go out here, we're going to go, talk about some other group and say, well, we're a better church than they. In fact, I developed this practice in my own evangelism. When I'm talking to somebody who's looking for a church, if we don't have what they want, I give them suggestions of another. Well, yeah, you sound more like that group would fit. And they're a really good group. They're different than we are, but they're a really good group. Go there. Because it's all about the kingdom. It's about the kingdom growing. It's about Christ being praised and lifted up. It's about the message of the cross being spread. And so as we go forth, as we spread the story, you can invite other Christians, especially those who are new to town or those who are looking for a new home. That's great. But we want to find those who are really searching for something in their life, the true meaning in their life. And the meaning that they're missing is the meaning found in the cross. So I'd invite the praise team to come up as we kind of finish this morning and say, Paul throughout this letter is going to stress unity. And if you look very closely as you read through this letter, what you will find is that a lot of the issues that he will address, several of the issues he will address, have to do with unity. Because he recognizes something that I think we've forgotten. That the testimony of a Christian is not just about our own personal lives, but it's about what we do together as community. So may that with us, praise him. Let's continue to praise our God.